this session is about optimizing Sitecore for global delivery, but the focus will be on how to optimize using the edge. Now, I'll also optimize the session, so it's only going to be 2 minutes. No, bad joke. Actually, I just want to introduce Nick, who is on our team. He was supposed to be here, and this was supposed to be his session. He's really good at deep diving and finding performance crimes in Sitecore and tuning and finding these extra 100, 200 milliseconds in the application. But unfortunately, he cannot be here. He's in Ukraine. He's between 18 and 60 years old and male, so he suggested I took over instead. His session, because he's so eager and he loves presenting, his session is actually on his LinkedIn. So I really suggest that you go in, add him, and find the session when I don't know if he has posted it yet, but he will very soon. He sent it to me yesterday. So that's my shout out to Nick. And a few words about me. I'm old. I've been in the web industry since forever, since it was invented. My first browser was something called Mosaic, coming out in '93. This was the grandfather or the father of Netscape. And I've been doing a lot of things in that space until 2010, where I joined Sitecore as a product manager. And the first product I was tasked to release was a module called Sitecore Azure, which you heard a little bit of bashing about yesterday. If you ever worked with that, it's fully understandable. It was amazing at the time. You would click somewhere and it would deploy to Azure. If you did the prerequisites the right way, things have evolved a lot since. In 2016, I left Sitecore. I started something called Copenhagen Mist. We do a lot of stuff on Azure, especially leveraging a lot of optimization tools around us. And my spare time, I don't have much spare time, but I like measuring stuff, like Nick. We have a fundamental belief that you can't really improve things without fully understand it. So the more we can instrument, measure, and data mine, the better we can drive things to better places performance. And I will go deeper into some of the techniques here, and I will encourage you to leverage some of this yourself. So instead of going on the Nick deep dive and going into topics like how to globally distribute, etc., I'm going to focus on how you can optimize and maximize what you're doing on the edge without actually rewriting your solution. There's a lot of solutions that are brand new, modern, built on using tools like Jamstack, etc. But there's also a ton of solutions out there that's not really ripe for being rewritten that can still be optimized. And that's very easy gain. So let's go into some of the fundamentals first. This might seem like a truism and very obvious, but faster pages, they really matter. I could just leave the room now, and that will be fine. So you have a faster page response, you get better user experience, you get better retention of the visitors, you get better conversion rates, your search ranking will improve. It's simply better for business. Everything relies on the very first page that you serve. Obviously, and probably all of you, to one extent or the other, is using caching, etc. But fact is, there's also stuff that's not really suitable for caching, especially if you're using a platform like Sitecore, where you have a lot of personalization opportunities and transactional installations as well, such as commerce. Okay, that's point number one. So faster is better for business. Point number two is the more you move to the edge, the more you reduce the load on your origins. So your CD servers in the typical setup, and that means that you reduce the resource drain on them. You reduce the cost through that. You increase the stability. So from an operational point of view, that's better. And I know because what we do in Mist is really entirely focused on the operation. So we have a lot of data of what's going on. We can see the impact of changing things. We can see that across different sites and properties. Okay, that's number one on the fundamentals. So the other thing, another truism is, it sounds like it in the marketing material, but fact is that you cannot do everything on the edge. If you have a completely static website, sure, but most are not. So certain things need to talk to the origin. If you're logged in, if you have a user account or something like that, you cannot move that to the edge. If you have a shopping basket or anything like that, or any other transactional flow, you need to talk to the origin. You might even need to talk to a origin instead of distributed origins. So while you can do a lot on the edge, it really doesn't mean that you can do everything. And there's still a lot that you do on the edge that you're not doing right. And we're going to go into soon why and how to figure that out. So if we look at the planet, which is very small in the grand scheme of the size of the universe, it's still quite big, because the fastest we can do is travel at the speed of light, and that also applies to electrons and fibers. So that's the absolute best we can do. And from Australia to Europe, there's still hundreds of milliseconds. And between that, because it's not a perfect connection, you also have the quality of the network or networks that are between the user and the server. And that will make it even worse, sometimes a lot worse. So boiling it down, it means that everybody will do worse than the speed of light, and the speed of light is pretty bad. Now, if we add in something like HTTPS, which I hope everybody's adding in, you're amplifying the problem, because when you're connecting to a server and you're asking for a secure connection, there's a handshake taking place first. So instead of going from, prime example, Australia to Europe, you'll be going back and forth 3 times. That's expensive, and that can be mitigated as well. But let's have a look at, in a minute, how to quantify this and how to work with it. Another pet peeve, and another really, really important point, and we'll elaborate in a second, is that most people don't really know how their sites perform globally. They know how it works for them, in their office, with their team leaders, etc. But how does this perform on the other side of the planet? Sure, yes, boss, I'm happy to go on a flight and check it out. I'm happy to try to measure it in a simpler way. But the reality is that the myopic approach here is really that it works for me, classic developer view, including myself. It works for me, so it must work great for everybody else. Let's have a look at a reality. One of the tools that we're using is that we have installed some probes around the globe, and we're measuring, what you're seeing here is time to first byte from different locations. So time to first byte is the very first character that you're getting of the HTML document that you will be fetching in order to fetch all the other things that may or may not be cached. That's your absolute choke point for getting started. And you can optimize that in different ways. But the point I want to get across here is that in this case, and this is a customer, before we really got into them, their application was responding really fast. 200 milliseconds, that's nice. But as we move into Asia, and it's a little difficult to see Australia here, but it's actually 1600 milliseconds with all the networking taking place to get that single byte from here to there. This is on probing. Now, this customer may or may not have any visitors from Australia. How will we know? So if you go into the logs instead and you start to map that out, and I don't have a global example of that, but we are doing some of this, it becomes very clear that in some cases, and a disproportionate amount of time is spent on waiting for things that shouldn't be waited for. Optimization targets. So the problem with probing is the following. The main problem, and I have a table on this in a second. When you probe something to get an idea of what's going on, you have already determined what you're looking for. You have set your eyes on a specific page that you're testing from a specific location at a specific frequency under conditions that you have predetermined. It tells very little about, it's not bad data, but it tells very little about what's actually going on. But you are biased for what you're getting, and the value of it is actually quite limited. So probes will show you really what you want to see. And over time, probes can be great because they can reveal some changes and things that are going better or worse from that. Now, if you dive into the logs of what's going on and the time of flight for every single request, and you start to split this out into the type of requests and map it into geography, then you get exactly what's going on for the real users, with the real browsers and clients that they're using, And that will give you a view of what you should really be targeting for optimization, instead of guessing on the stuff that you already predetermined through probes. And this will happen completely irrespective of time, URL, location, etc. It's the real view. So let's just compare it side by side. Probes versus doing log searches and BI on that is the frequency on probes, typically every 5 minutes from whatever location, fine. When you use your log intelligence or edge intelligence, you get all of it. Probing, you get certain URLs, the ones you're targeting, and to make it worse, the more URLs there's a P missing. The more URLs you're targeting, the more noise you generate. Because every request you send to the server is an additional request. Anyone here knows what a mystery shopper is? Right, you have this guy, typically a student, whatever, gets an allowance to go into McDonald's, eat for free, and report back what's going on. And they do this to measure the quality of the service in whatever McDonald's restaurant they're visiting. This is great. It's equivalent to probing. Now, if you really want to know everything, you'll be probing a hell of a lot. And that means that in the McDonald's analogy, that you'll be sending 200 people to this McDonald's. And I've seen examples of that. Not in McDonald's, but on the website. And that actually means that all of a sudden the probing traffic becomes more intense than the organic visitor traffic. You start making noise. And going back to the previous point, you start taking up resources. You're increasing the risk of error rates, etc. So probing is good in limited ways, but probing will not give you the full picture. And if you try to drive probing to provide the full picture, you're going to do some really bad things. So there's some adverse effect of interference from probing. So besides being the specific URLs you're targeting, typically your front page, maybe another page, the transaction type and how the behavior is and what you're seeing from the probe is defined by the nature of the probe. Where in the real world, people are sitting on a cornfield somewhere with a browser and a bad connection, or they're sitting on some really thick fibers and have an amazing connection. But all of this stuff is not something you have any idea of until you start looking into the actual data. Same for location. Why sample 20-something places in the world when you can have all the places in the world mapped out, or at least each edge location as a measurement point for these transactions? So I think at this point it should be pretty obvious that I love this and I tolerate that. And I would encourage you to move that way as well. So here's some examples of what can be found this way. And these are just examples. So while Nick would be talking about performance crimes and horrendous things that you find at the sewers of your solution, what I'm finding is not crimes, but something that you have in the front that you might want to change. So here's an example. This is from a customer. I was nice enough to remove their name and call them Contoso on this one. But they had on their front page a redirect from customername.com to /en. Seems very innocent. Now, if you go use a tool like PageSpeed Insights, other probing tools, the impact and the value of this will not really be revealed. But if we start quantifying and we look at what's actually going on, we can see this is for a month, 168,000 times, and a median delay between the edge and the origin of almost 400 milliseconds. You multiply this, and you get to, let me translate this. This is 18 hours. 18 hours per month waiting for this redirect. This is a redirect that takes a couple of minutes to move to the edge. So if we go back to the world map again, and you imagine the redirect takes place here, and you have a visitor coming from Singapore, they would need to go call the server, say, hey, I would like the front page. And this one says, no, you have to go to /en. Okay, I'm going to /en. That's a long time to wait for basically nothing. A little piece of redirection logic that can be set up on the edge. How do you know what to do? Well, you basically don't know until you start looking at what's going on. What requests are you getting? What's the wait time? Where are they coming from? Is there something that should be done a different way? As you can see as well, the other targets here, sure, there's time to save. But then we get to the qualification of this. Is it worth it? Do we want to move these other redirections to the edge? Yes. I'm not going to give you the answer. It's an individual decision. But knowing it matters a whole lot versus being blind to it. Right, let's go with another example. And all of this is coming from doing these this BI work on the edge logging. Okay, here's another example. In the customer, we saw 130 gigabytes of egress from something that was uncached. And turns out it's the Mexican flag. This country selector, language selector that's on every single page, this little bit of tiny icon took up 500K, and it was on every single page, uncached. Wonderful. Now, from a server point of view, that's probably not going to put a lot of load in. From a cost point of view, that's not going to put a lot of load in. For the user, this is likely lazy loaded, so they wouldn't really notice this, but the impact on the cost of the data transfer is not insignificant. And it turns out that what you see in here, so the Dutch flag is pretty clean, but the Mexican flag has this little blob in the middle. It's the animal kingdom. Any guesses? Favorite animal to put in flags? No? Here we go. It's a very proud eagle eating a rattlesnake while it's sitting on a cactus. And I can say on the Croatian flag, which was also a sinner here, there's a goat and a ferret of some sort in that flag. I had no idea, but you go from here to here, and no one would notice this under normal circumstances. That's bad. And it's also super easy to fix. Now, another problem with this was it was uncached. So in this case, the customer was actually set up to cache all the media items. But this one was outside the path of the media item, like a lot of other things. Anything from style sheets to JavaScript, etc., structured in ways or being added at a later point. So they end up outside the cache path, and nobody knows about this. Which brings me to another one we'll get to in a second. Okay, here's another one. There's another thing that's cached on analyzing what happens on the edge. And this is actually a piece of code that's misbehaving. So if we look at the median times here, and we look at what's going on the URL, it's very clear that there's the more you skip, the longer the wait is. So there's some pagination stuff going on here in this rendering. That's most likely a bug. Now, no one on the client side or developer side of in this case was aware of this condition, and it just pops out when you look at the analytics of what's going on. Should be easy to fix as well. Well worth it. This is where you have transactions, customer activity. Right. Let me dive into some common traps of how to approach this, or what you get from not approaching it, and what you get from doing it right. The first one, case in point, the flag, the redirect. You assume that what you're doing on the edge is working optimally and correctly. You assume it. It's as expected. One of the main reasons is that when it's set up initially, it's fine. Whoever did it, looked at it, and it works out well. But in a world where you have content editors that can change things, you have other developers working on things, changing the solution over time, this will erode, this will change. And they can change very quickly. So instead of assuming and taking a static approach to this, getting a best practice that actually is a continuous approach to capturing the data and do a little bit of hygiene and house cleaning on the optimization is fairly easy and well worth it. So over time, you'll get to not leveraging the cache optimally. Continuous monitoring, absolutely critical here. Measure, optimize, monitor, and keep going on that. All right. Trap number 2. Not all optimizations are equal. Going back to the point from the redirection, if you start looking at how often something is requested and the time impact from that request, and this could also be Australian people requesting Mexican flags for whatever reason. The weighing of things is not something you will get using probes. Probes will not tell you how often something happens. Probes will not tell you what the time impact from where this happens the most. So you can say the accumulated time to wait in a given region of the world. Where do you have your hotspots? Where do you have your pain points? That will not come from probes. So again, if you're probing and you base your analysis on a sliver of what's going on, then you're really just optimizing to your own beliefs instead of reality. And we can all use a little reality check from time to time. The solution, pretty obvious. Use log intelligence. Dive into the data, the actual data. Of course, don't ignore what the probe is saying, or the probes are saying. They're helpful in other ways. And then simply go from the top. Start optimizing with the high impact optimizations. Typically, they're very low effort. They're very high impact. We get them out of the way. When we onboard a customer, we find a lot of dirt. That's the initial process. Clean that up and get down to something that's smaller, and that's open for discussion whether it should be dealt with or not. It's really simple once you get your head around it. But for some reason, people are not doing this. Trap number 3. There's a very strong focus on simply caching media items. It seems simple. They are often completely static. They can be moved to a CDN or the edge. But what about the rest? Most pages, they need other static items. CSS, JavaScript, etc. Some of it, as I mentioned, is in surprising paths and are not cached. And all of this are completely obvious candidates to move to the edge. One of the things that we use as an analysis is we look at things that respond very fast. So if you have a response from the server less than 20 milliseconds, you're likely static. You're definitely not a Sitecore page. And if you're static, you're a candidate to be moved to the edge. So that's some of the stuff we're analyzing for. And that will drive, fundamentally, because your time to first byte is your bottleneck in every operation, the more you can move to the edge of all kinds of operations, the better. That's a pretty plain fact. Once you have that, then there's some stuff you cannot move, and the focus can go into optimizing that. And I'm not going to go into, I'm happy to have a conversation over coffee, but I'm not going to go into how you can optimize the rest, because that's a much deeper topic and also something Nick. I'm actually really optimized because I'm a lot faster than expected. So here's the last bit that I have. We can take some questions as well, of course. Reach out to me, connect. I love this topic. I'm happy to discuss it. I'm happy to do it in detail. I'm happy to provide a mapping of whatever properties you're working on. We have the tool set for that. It's always fun to find these things. One of the benefits of what we do is because we're running multiple things, we actually get to benchmark across the properties. We're not just looking at whatever one side is doing and performing. So we know when something is good and something is less good. That also helps. Benchmarking is very effective. Yep.
Do we have any questions? Please raise your hand.
I thank you for the session. Really nice thoughts. What is the tool set that you're using to probe and also find out which pages are slow and which are fast?
Right. So probing, if we go on this one, that's something that's proprietary. Well, it's not super secret what it is, but we set up containers in all these locations. They're running curl against the targets, and we're then capturing data on some distinct intervals, 6-hour intervals. So we do 3 calls, and then we even it out over time. And that's also why that you'll see the color scale here is actually fairly pretty. It's not because I was sitting in Photoshop doing this. It's because it's a smoothed average over time. In this case, we also in these locations run Google Lighthouse, and we capture other things like the page speed scores and the core web vitals, and we we transmit this data back actually, and we time it over time into the dashboarding and analytics solution we have, which is connected to both the data that's being transmitted from all these measuring stations, but they also capture data from the logs of the edge services that we use. And our shop is completely Azure focused, but the analytics that you can get from Cloudflare, Akamai, etc., is fairly similar and can be mapped to these kinds of queries and analytics solutions. So bringing all of that together, it's really about sourcing the data. You're not using any, or you could build, if you want to go on, what's it called, webpagetest.org, they have an API. So instead of setting up your own measuring stations, you could actually pull from that API and bring that data together.
Hi. When using logging to measure the wait time for a recipient of a page, is that getting a confirmation from the recipient that they've received the page and measuring it, or is it more just on the...
Right. So this is the time of flight from the edge to the origin. Basically from the request hits the edge, the pop at the edge, and until it gets a response from the origin. What happens from the edge and until the point of time that it's rendered in someone's browser is something we cannot influence. Really. The time of flight of the data from the pop to the browser is something we cannot influence. How things are behaving in the browser is something we can influence. So let's say that we would be edge caching this URL, this page. Then this time would go to, if not 0, then something like 5 milliseconds, because it's the time for the edge to respond to the request it's getting. So it's also a question of viewing this in what you can influence and what you cannot influence. And that's also, you could say, a philosophical stance that we want to focus on stuff that we can change. You can have dashboards with all kinds of things that's out of your hands. It's not going to help you a whole lot. It's going to distract you. Or then you should have a dashboard that you give to someone else and say, this is your stuff. Please focus on this. And then I would say the major point is actually multiplying with the time of the times that this is being requested, because that will give you the overall impact. So this one might not be worth fixing, and then again, maybe it will be worth fixing this one, the first one. I don't know what the commercial impact is on something like this. For looking at the order history and how that ties into repeat orders. But I'm betting it's something. And I'm betting the client would love someone to fix it and work on that. I mean, this is code, we wouldn't touch that part.
Maybe slightly out of scope. Is there a way to get the total time metric on a classic website where you don't have any edge? Just from IIS or something?
Well, yes and no, because the edge will tell you where the visitors are coming from. So what we would do is that we would take our tooling, we'd put it in front of whatever old website. It doesn't even have to be Sitecore. So that's why the first slide is actually a bit of a misdemeanor. And we'll intercept the traffic. So run everything through the edge, have the edge spit out all the logging, and then do the data mining on that logging for specific actions. So you have two scenarios again. So probing you can do from the outside without knowing and being connected to any of the inside. Oops. So probing can be done without touching anything. You'll interfere because you're generating traffic as part of the probing. Log intelligence is a principle where you can say you intercept the traffic by putting an edge between the client and the origin, which is sensible in any case, and have that edge spit out log data that you can then work on in different ways, actively. I don't know if that answered the question, or it's just a lot of words. Well, I mean, if you're doing load balancing on-prem, and you have, I mean, there's no reason not to have using an edge service in front of that. In my opinion. Maybe there's some arguments that I'm not familiar with, but it's an offloading. So using an edge also does other things. So when we go into things like Let me show you this one. Now it gets a little more technical. This is establishing an HTTPS connection. So you have the browser, it does the DNS lookup, it does the TCP handshake first, then it does an SSL handshake if it needs to, and then you wait for the server to respond and you transfer the data back. Now, if you imagine this takes place from Australia, down here. Now, if you can move some of this to the edge as well, and you can, sorry, spoiler, if you can move this part to the edge, instead of the handshake going from Australia to Europe and back again, but the handshake happens within Australia, then you save a lot of time. And the impact of that is actually what you can see here. So this is before and after of moving the SSL handshake to the edge. Yeah. If we want to have more fun, on this client, they also wanted distributed CDs, so we added that to the mix, and then it went real pretty, depending on your licensing and other things. And this is a deeper setup. Now, if we go back to the first slide about Nick and what he would be great at, it would be like taking this time. Actually, please note the application got slow in the meantime. That's not our fault. He would shave off, say, 100 milliseconds here, but that also means that you're gaining time here, here, here. That's across the board. So there's two problems that you really need to deal with, and I'm only addressing one of them here. One is your time of flight to origin and how much you need to hit the origin. The other one is the natural response time of your application. That will be Nick's specialty, driving that down. But things can be done. And this is actually an old application, so it's not all headless, CSS, yada, yada, yada. It's something that can be, I mean, we all know the trouble that upgrading a Sitecore solution can be in terms of hours, etc. Some of our customers are on solutions that are actually as old as when I was in Sitecore. Yes, that old. But it doesn't mean it cannot be improved without touching the application. So there's a lot of stuff that you can optimize around your application without messing too much with the application. And I know whenever there's a problem, Sitecore will always say upgrade, 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 but again, and that's a lot of billable hours for a lot of happy people. I'm not one of them. Right?
Any other questions?
But by the way, if anyone would like a map of this, of your project, just shoot me an email and we'll set it up and we'll give you the reality of what's going on.
All right. Yeah. And thank you for this presentation. It's really great.
Thank you for listening, paying attention.